complex topic. In truth, actually, it's really simple. It's about building strength in your commercial position, building strength to give yourself freedom to act, and also doing the simple things which over time accumulate strength for you. So your own IP drives decision making for other people. It's about making sure that your own IP is an item on other people's risk register when they're making decisions. Mathys and Squire have had a partnership with the MTA for a short time now, and I'm pleased to say that we're engaged in some research with the sector. Our researcher, who was here mere moments ago, may have spoken to some of you by telephone. Has he spoken to anyone here? Yep, just one. Okay. So to increase the coverage a little bit, how many of you here see IP as a priority in what you do? 2, 3. You're a patent attorney, so you don't count. So that's a fairly low. I'd say that's a fairly low percentage, given that we're engaged here in technology. We're engaged in the business of technology. Now, my own understanding from working with people in this sector, and also from the research we've done so far, is that people have lots of questions about IP, and there's a range of levels of engagement. Things like the unitary patent, the coming unitary patent, are a big issue. People understand that it's a significant change in the framework in which they need to operate commercially. People understand that they need to take account of the changing IP position in China. They need to position themselves to deal with that. Also, there's a question about the boundaries of different IP rights. I'm not sure that everyone is really comfortable about where the boundaries of different rights might lie, and what might be protectable and what might not, and what's sensible to protect. There are lots of questions there. My own view actually is that IP is central to everything that is done in manufacturing technologies. And commercial relevance, commercial value is key. I mean, what does it really mean to the bottom line? How does it matter to you when you're making decisions commercially, when you're considering whether to get engaged in a project or not, when you're considering whether to change suppliers or to make a modification in a product that you're selling? Now, personally, I've worked with a client in the manufacturing sector for about 10 years now. I'm very proud to say that Mathys and Squire were part of Taylor Hobson's IP team for a long time. I was part of the team which put together their contact and non-contact metrology portfolios. The firm as a whole has been around for over 100 years, 105 years in fact. And lots of the clients shown on this slide have been with us for time periods which are measured in decades. So IP is clearly significant to these people. It's been a significant part of my career to date. It's certainly significant for Taylor Hobson. They're a wonderful company. I encourage you to go and see their stand. I think it's about 3 or 4 blocks back there. But there's 2 things I'd like to say at this point. The first is this: patent attorneys aren't just lawyers. We're engineers, and we're engaged in science and research, and so we're interested in understanding clients' technology and clients' business. The other thing that I think's important to say is we learn about clients' commercial realities, the sphere of risk and opportunity in which they operate, from having conversations with them. As an engineering manager I've worked with for a number of years now, and to give you an insight into his decision making around IP risk, I remember a time we were discussing a third-party patent we'd come across. It covered what he wanted to do. It was almost certainly an infringement risk for him. And so we went away and we looked for evidence to try to invalidate that patent. We spent some time and money searching, and we came back and we gave him a very long, very detailed, considered piece of advice. And I said, Bill, look, it's probably invalid. We can probably knock it out. We've got a good arguable case. I think we can knock the patent out. And he looked at this new project that he wanted to start, and he looked at the patent risk. And he said, I can't do this. It's just not worth it. The hazard here is too high. I can't be certain that I can knock this out. There's a danger here, and the impact associated with this risk is too high for me to ignore. It's not just the reputational damage associated with an action for patent infringement. It's not just the cost and hassle in managerial time of having to defend such an action. It's an enormous distraction. Actually, it's not even the risk of having to pay damages. What if, at the end of an unsuccessful action for patent infringement, I end up with an order for the delivery up and destruction of the piece of kit which I am about to invest huge amounts of time and money in creating? What if I have a warehouse full of product and I have to hand that over to the competition for them to destroy? These are enormous, high-impact risks, and they have to be taken account of. So my view is that the purpose of IP risk management actually isn't just to deal with that conventional kind of IP risk. Most people, when they think about IP risk, probably think in those terms. They probably think in terms of infringement of third-party IP. I mean, it's the most natural thing that comes to mind. But actually, there's more to it than that, because when Bill made that decision not to pursue that project, he made a decision not to take action. He did nothing. And doing nothing itself is a risk, because by doing that, you leave a space in the market for somebody else to move in. It's significant. How do you get a free hand? So when you're in that position, when you're making that risk calculation, you can take the actions in the marketplace that you know to be necessary. So we'll need to go on a bit of a detour. I'll need to talk to you a little bit about the different types of IP which I believe to be relevant in this sector and where they arise. I'll give you a general high-level definition of IP risk so you can see the whole thing in context. I'll show you a risk register. It's a fairly straightforward one, but a risk register of sorts which you can use as a model to consider risk calculations in IP, and then give you 3 case studies to tie everything together. And throughout the discussion, the intention is to talk about mitigation. We're here talking about risk mitigation and about the control of risk to provide you with freedom to act. So the theme running through everything will be mitigation, but I'll leave you with some small practical thoughts about the things that you can do to improve your IP position over time. So despite the relatively low level of engagement from my initial survey, I think we had 2 of an audience of about 20. So at the moment we've got a 10% uptake, people saying IP is important to them. How many of you here deal with issues associated with software? Software is not important to anything you do. No control systems, no process control, no systems integration. What about the shape of a piece of manufacturing tooling? The shape of a manufacturing press or a mold? Even project documentation. If these things are significant to you, then copyright is an issue. Copyright is an issue for your business. It's part of your business. Now, copyright's an effective legal right. but it's uncertain and it's difficult to enforce. It's not a risk you can ignore by any means, but being on the rights holder side of a risk calculation, looking at copyright as your only course of action, you have a significant uncertainty to deal with, because copyright is a question of evidence. You need to be able to prove copying. You need to be able to prove originality and authorship. So if you're going to rely on IP, on copyright to defend your IP, then even before you can begin to consider the risk landscape, you need to think, actually, there's an uncertainty here and a cost associated with finding out the result of that uncertainty as to whether I'm even going to be able to enforce that right. Copyright inherently is an uncertain issue. How about design right? How about the aesthetic appearance of a product? Are aesthetics important in the products you work with? Just a show of hands, roughly. The appearance of your product important? Okay, so we've got sort of 4 or 5. So now you begin to see that actually there is IP in the things that you do. And with designs, in fact, there's been some really high-profile litigation recently, some high-profile changes in the landscape with designs. Have you heard about the Trunky decision? You know what happened with the Trunky suitcases? So there's a salutary lesson in how to control IP risk. They, at the outset of the Trunky story, there were some fairly hurried, perhaps not altogether entirely well thought through registrations filed to cover the suitcase that you see people wheeling their children through the airport on. And the effectiveness of the legal right associated with that piece of IP was fundamentally compromised by something as trivial as the quality of the drawings that they registered. They registered a 3D rendering. They registered a CAD drawing of the suitcase. That was the representation in their design. And as a result, the scope of protection they were given meant that a large Chinese manufacturer was able to import a commercially acceptable substitute for their product and to displace them in the market because they hadn't spent probably, I don't know, maybe £300 getting a decent draftsman to do the drawings for them. Anyway, it's a slight digression. In the sphere of IP rights, there are different things that are at issue. There's also the question of confidential information and know-how. If you're engaged with work with engineers, then actually the engineers in your business carry around in their heads really significant bundles of IP. They're a walking, living, breathing IP risk. When they walk out of the door, what's going to happen? When they start working with your competitors, what's going to happen? How do you control that? Conversely, of course, when a new engineer walks into your business and starts working with you, working in absolute good faith, working to the best of his abilities, how do you know he's not inadvertently, by working in his old ways, going to walk you into the IP that he's used to working with every single day? Contamination of IP through that kind of transfer of confidential information is a real issue. It happens. Branding and goodwill, trademarks are perhaps not the primary focus here, but they belong in the risk register. The branding of your products belongs in the risk register that you consider when you're making decisions here. And lastly, but certainly not least, patents. I think I've heard patent infringement and patent litigation described as being the sport of kings. Patent litigation in the English courts is mind-bendingly expensive. It's horrendous. But patents themselves aren't. The cost of obtaining patent protection is measured in a few thousands. I think possibly the cost of not having patent protection is often measured in millions. Let me tell you another story, just a brief one. Bill, my friend who made the decision about whether or not to begin a project, often looks at inventions that his engineers make and dismisses them as being obvious. He looks at them and says, there's no point applying for a patent for that. It's obvious. Fair enough. It's a rational decision. He's under cost pressure. His budget is a big issue. Is he really going to commit another £5,000 of an already tight budget to getting a patent application on file? Fair enough. I have other conversations with Bill, just like the conversation I had with him about that third-party patent, when he was deciding whether to start his new project or not. We were looking at a patent that we had evidence in front of us to show was obvious. He was looking at a piece of advice from us saying, this patent here is obvious, you can probably get on with this project. And he made a decision about risk. And he said, I can't pursue this project because of the risk of patent infringement. So you can see there's an asymmetry here. On the one hand, when he's making an assessment of obviousness of his own IP, he chooses not to spend 5K on filing a patent application. When he's looking at a potentially lucrative new project, faced with a patent which is ostensibly obvious, which probably we can knock out, he's not prepared to take the risk. And there's an imbalance there, because clearly, if when he's making that decision, when he's deciding what to do, his decision-making is being driven by patents which other people hold, which he considers to be obvious. So why shouldn't he be putting himself in the position of being the rights holder, of holding that IP which drives other people's decision-making? Just a thought. So I've walked around the hall today, and almost every single stand that I see here, there's so much IP, I don't even know where to start. It's in everything in this sector, not just the metrology and quality control and surface finish measurement that I know about in this sector from my work with Taylor Hobson and Amatec, but also it's there in the control software, it's in the systems integration. If you're going to put together a complex manufacturing line, actually how the different bits of kit go together and how they talk to each other and how you organize that manufacturing process, all of that is protectable IP. There's not just stuff there that's potentially patentable, there's also copyright in the code, there's confidential information in the know-how that makes the system work and puts it all together. There's a whole forest, a landscape of IP issues there. So far, I think you understand more or less my starting point. My view of the position is that IP is present in everything in manufacturing technology, and IP risk drives how people make decisions. And what I mean by IP risk isn't just the conventional question of infringement of a third-party patent. It's just any threat or any opportunity associated with intellectual property, and that's not just IP that's held by your competitors. Also, it's IP that your customer might hold, which covers the product which you sell to them, or covers the use of that product. Because if your customer holds IP which is relevant to your business, what are you going to do when they try to control your access to markets that aren't favorable to them? Could that be an issue for you? What if your supplier holds IP which covers their product, and you decide you need to find an alternative source of supply? What if they decide that the product they've been selling to you for years, they want to increase the price of that product? How do you react to that if their IP covers the product? It's an issue. Now, I'm an IP specialist. I'm not someone who's engaged in the management of complex risk in projects on a day-to-day basis, and I need a simple model to understand how risk goes together. And I tend to think about it like this: you're looking at the world, looking at a particular project, and you can think, okay, there are certain threats I need to take account of. There are certain risks to my business here, and they might be really, really quite unlikely, really unlikely to happen, or they might be almost certainties. Okay, so you're looking at a vertical axis of probability, and you're looking at a horizontal axis of impact. The stuff that's going to happen over here, probably it's an irritation, but it doesn't really matter to you that much. The stuff that happens over here is going to put you out of business. So it makes sense, really, when considering items in this sort of landscape, considering threats in this landscape, to pay attention up here, yeah, in the top right of your threats grid. This is where you're going to focus your attention. The things that are likely to happen, or the things that are really high reward, and preferably where the two meet. It makes sense, right? And similarly, when you're considering opportunities, the things that you can get out of a project, there are things which might be really unlikely. You know, down here you're just about as likely to win the lottery, right? And over here, in terms of benefit, there's the stuff that make or break. This will build your company. This is the big win for you if you can get this stuff to work. So you can see that you have to focus your attention somewhere in this matrix of risk and opportunity, somewhere in this risk of impact and benefit. So you're paying attention to the stuff that really counts. You're going to grab the low-hanging fruit, get the value out of a project. That's how you make sensible decisions, and you focus on the stuff that matters. Coming at this risk calculation from the perspective of a patent attorney, from someone who's engaged in IP, I ask myself, well, where does IP sit in this matrix of risk and opportunity? And it occurs to me that often in mature, well-developed technologies, if you're engaged in manufacturing technology, there are frequently incremental changes in what you do, small changes, perhaps individually not that exciting, not that significant. And so you look at the IP and you think, well, probably unlikely to be relevant, probably relatively low reward. When you're looking at it as a threat, well, where does it sit? I'm not sure. Perhaps it depends on the project itself. Generally, from project to project, my own background, before I was a patent attorney, actually I was engaged in software development and project management for software development. We tended to look at this kind of calculation on a project by project basis. We'd look at each job as it came along. This is the project, this is our delivery date, this is when we need to hand the software over up and running to the customer. But when you're dealing with IP, the risk matrix isn't one-dimensional like that. It's not just a single project. It's not just a single one-time thing, because you can buy real estate in this matrix. You can buy insurance in this matrix, and that means your incremental changes can add up. The things which to you in any given project in terms of opportunity belong down here. They're low probability and relatively low impact. If you're continually working in a fairly tight, fairly small field of technology, and you're making incremental changes, you accumulate them over time. As you go along, you build them up. You build an IP footprint in this space. And as projects develop and they go along, your IP footprint grows and it becomes bigger, and so it moves up the probability ladder and potentially also moves up in terms of benefit, because you can leverage it more. It's more relevant. It's more relevant to where the value is. But then you need to think about the same thing from the other side, right? Because it's not just about opportunities. There's another side to the risk calculation, because the guy on the other side, the guy who's making decisions on the other side of the table, has a matrix of his own. He's looking at this same thing, making the same decisions, and things which were your small opportunities down here, your small IP opportunities with low impact, actually, over time, they accumulate. They rise up the probability ladder because they grow in size, and they drive decision making. So that's all quite abstract, I suppose. The matrix, I'm talking about different types of IP and different types of risk. I was engaged in a situation recently, and to protect the identities of those concerned, I need to simplify it a little and to remove all of the identifying detail. We work with a client who has consumer equipment in probably 95% of homes in the United Kingdom. And for the purposes of this example, let's say that piece of equipment is a mousetrap. recently, their supplier of mousetraps that they take and install into every British home increased the price by about 30%. And in real practical terms, they have no viable commercial alternative other than a Chinese manufacturer. And so their procurement guys went out to this Chinese manufacturer and they said, we need a mousetrap. We need a mousetrap like this. It needs to catch a mouse of this particular size and weight. It needs to be this reliable. Can you do it for us? And these guys are really clever. They've got great technology. They went away, and sure enough, they came back with a mousetrap which answered the brief exactly. Took them about 8 months. And so the procurement team phoned me up, and they said, we're about to change these mousetraps that we're going to install into every home in the UK. What does the risk look like for us? Can we do it? Stick with the example of a mousetrap for a minute. How many elements of this mousetrap do you think might be protectable with a patent? Say, for example. Just choose one. Choose an example. Sorry? Yeah, the spring. Okay, great. So the winding of the spring, not just the presence of a spring, but the way it's arranged. Yeah, to give you the, for example, I don't know, the killing stroke, right? The power of delivery. Okay, but it wasn't just the spring. It was the shape of the trigger, and it was the formation of the tread board here that the poor little mouse steps on before he gets taken out. And it was the way in which the killing arm is fixed. And it was the formation of these pins. And it was the type of wood in the base of the mousetrap. All of these tiny little incremental changes, all of these individually insignificant things, all of which represented a real risk. And we looked at it and we said, okay, they've got patents on all of these things, patents on all of this stuff. Are they really going to take action? Because that's the next step in the calculation, right? The other side's got all this IP. Are they really going to do anything about it? And we said, well, you're quite high profile. You're intending to replace their product in every home in the United Kingdom. And once you've done that, what about their other customers? What about their other customers in the rest of Europe? So in terms of considering the IP risk, the other side will be motivated to act. They've got the opportunity to act and they have the motivation. And so we asked your Chinese manufacturer, what IP do they have? Do they have anything they can bring to the table? If your existing manufacturer of mousetraps comes calling, can we say, nice patent you've got there, mate. We've got some of our own too. Why don't you take a look and we can have a sensible discussion? Did they have anything? They had nothing at all. We had nothing to fight with. And so we were faced with a situation where the risk calculation was entirely weighted against us. We were looking at patents. Perhaps we could have knocked out 2 or 3, but the fact is the other side only has to get lucky once. We have to be lucky every single time, right? Let's say we're looking at a patent and we think there's a 50% chance I can knock this out. Or there's a 50% chance they'll get home on infringement. If there's one of those, it's a 50-50 chance. I might flip that coin. I might do it. If there are 2, the risk is cumulative, right? Because all of a sudden my 50% chance of getting home free becomes a 25% chance. And just one more patent in the mix, I've got a 10% chance or thereabouts, right? And actually, when you're looking at a 90% risk, where are you in that risk register? You're right up here. So from these tiny little things, each of which individually might themselves be unlikely to come home, you've got to a position where there's a risk and a real hazard there that you absolutely cannot ignore. We looked at that, and the replacement of mousetraps in this context was the maintenance of mousetraps in consumer homes was, I think, about 70,000 units a year. The unit cost of these mousetraps, they're quite advanced mousetraps, was about 150 quid. And the price increase was sort of 40 quid or thereabouts. And so over a year, it's a significant deal. It's a lot of money, right? 3 patents, 5K a go, right? You're driving risk calculations, you're punching above the weight in such an astronomical way, it almost doesn't bear thinking about. So year on year, there was significant revenue on the table, and they had to walk away from it. And the reason they had to walk away from it wasn't just because of this cumulative effect in terms of probability. It was also because of the high impact concerned, because in this context, an order for delivery up and destruction of the infringing goods, once they'd started to install them in consumer homes, would have meant sending engineers back to every home where they'd installed one, saying, I'm terribly sorry, we've got to rip out that illegal pump we installed, and by the way, I've got to buy one from my previous manufacturer because I haven't got a viable alternative and I'm going to have to put that in. The commercial, reputational risk, let alone the financial cost, made it totally impossible. Now, of course, we're not all the big players, we're not all the big guns. We can't all afford to be filing IP, filing patents on every single incremental change we make. There's a game to be played in spotting the opportunities. When you're dealing with an IP right, a legal right, which controls the thing that needs to be done to get the job done, whether getting the job done is doing something at lower cost, doing it more quickly, doing it to meet a particular customer specification. The thing you need to look for is the overlap between the commercial value and the scope of the legal right. Then you can identify those things where the gold is. And of course, I've already said it, but it bears saying again, this risk matrix here, it isn't one-dimensional. You're not looking just at a snapshot in time, you're looking at a progression over a series of projects, over 20 years potentially, the life of a patent. So okay, you're looking today at one project here, you're out here right on the left-hand side of your opportunity benefit space. But the game is that over time, that portfolio grows, because unlike, for example, copyright, copyright isn't necessarily cumulative. An individual copyright work isn't necessarily going to be relevant to some future technology. It's not necessarily going to be copied. You need an IP right which is objective and verifiable and just sits there and the other side can see it. Because when the other side see it, they're looking at your accumulated IP over time, the thing that started off as small changes and is now growing up in terms of its impact and its benefit. And they're making risk calculations, they're making decisions based on it. Just as in the example, the consumer product example that I just gave you, we had to leave all that cash on the table. We had to just pay the money. And there was no alternative, because we had no leverage. We had no answer to the threat. So there's a need to spot opportunities, but which opportunities? Which opportunities are those you're going to take? People think about patents and they think about the crazy-haired inventor, the guy who looks like Einstein, and he's coming up with the most incredibly intelligent, clever stuff you've ever thought of. But actually, that's not really where the interest is. If it's really that clever, if it's out here, so sorry, this is This is a very complicated relationship that I've established over years of scientific endeavor, and it's a relationship between the commercial value of any given invention and its cleverness. This is a relationship between cash and inventive step, basically, right? And if you're in the field of stuff which is really, really clever, right out here on the right-hand side of the graph, nobody cares, they don't want to buy it, right? It's the stuff that's just here, just on the cusp of being current technology. It's the stuff that people look at and say, damn, I wish I'd thought of that. It's the stuff, actually, that my friend Bill looks at and says, nah, it's obvious. It's putting a capacitive touchscreen on a mobile phone, right? It's the kind of technology which changes a market. So, mentioning Bill reminds me of something. Another situation I was in with him. I've worked with him for a considerable amount of time, and throughout my time with him, we've watched competitor IP. We watch the patent applications that other people file. And there's another technology company which is active in the same space. And they were getting away with murder. They were filing applications on stuff that, frankly, we thought they should never get away with. And Bill gradually over time got more and more irritated. And when I had the conversations with him, Bill, do you want to protect this? No, it's obvious. In the end, he got so annoyed, he said, okay, do it then. They're getting away with it, why shouldn't I? So we took this case, and bluntly, we filed it out of sheer irritation. Bill never thought we'd get it through, but we told the story in the right way, we presented it in the right way, and we got the patent granted. Fast forward 5 years, 6 years, that technology company we were watching got acquired and became part of the same group of companies. And the two R&D managers, my friend Bill and the guy from the other side, sat down to go through the portfolios together, to go through the technology together. And the guy on the other side put his finger on the irritation case, and he said, that one there, that's what drove our decision making. That's the one we couldn't get around. That's a key patent. And for me, that sums it up entirely. That risk calculation, looking at patents held by the other side, making that decision about obviousness, it's not a risk that anyone wants to take. What they see is a legal right that's ostensibly valid, and they have to take it into account. Okay, so far we've talked mostly about conventional, what I like to think of as sort of conventional IP risk, third-party infringement, basically. And fairly straightforward. Here, really, we're just talking about patents so far. Very briefly, I'll describe a set of circumstances to you. Meet an exciting new customer, agree to the development of some new technology, sign an NDA. No other IP agreement. Customer comes up with a requirement spec, gives you a purchase order. Still no IP agreement. You work together for some time, and then everything goes south. The relationship falls apart. There's a dispute over delivery. There's a dispute over the quality of the goods, whatever. There's a dispute over pricing, perhaps. Are these circumstances which sound familiar to you if you've dealt with cooperations with potential customers, right? Show of hands, roughly. How many people have seen an engagement where there's been an NDA and no other real IP agreement to speak of? Yeah, these are real life circumstances. Okay, so we were engaged in a project where our customer was making an electronic widget, piece of circuitry. And they had really exciting technology, really great background IP, and it was in the semiconductor, it was in the layout of the PCB, it was in the confidential information that was held in the heads of their engineers. And the customer was really interested in this. They really wanted to get involved. And they knew that we had source code, we had the firmware that would make this piece of kit work. But to meet their requirement spec, they needed to fine-tune it. And there were no patents on the table. No patents at all on the table. So what happened was, they got to a point where this widget was working and the software was running perfectly well, and they'd been working together under this NDA without any real clear understanding of who owned the different bits of IP and who really had originated what, and without really clear minutes of any meetings. Engineers go to meetings, they talk to each other, they come back with ideas, they change things, and nobody really knows whose ideas, where our ideas start and their ideas begin. Nobody is 100% sure what was copied from what and what we'd be able to prove was copied from what. There's a mess here of copyright in the source code, of copyright in the design documentation, of confidential information in the heads of the different engineers. And it's all tangled up, right? You can see that the background IP that we held in this sort of Venn diagram of IP, if you like, our background IP was necessary really for our customer to implement their product. They needed access to this background IP in order to do this stuff. Meanwhile, we'd come up with our own stuff. We'd come up with a new project, a new product we wanted to work on. And out of the blue, tier 1 automotive manufacturer comes knocking on the door and says, guys, we love you, we want to work with you, we want access to this stuff here, but we need an absolute indemnity. We need you to give us an indemnity that says there's no IP out there. We'll be reasonable. There's no IP out there of which you're aware that would be infringed by us taking your IP. This is a make the company deal. This is the biggest contract these guys have ever faced. Meanwhile, company B, on the other side, they want to go off and make and sell their product. They've done a long period of development with us. They've been working with us for a long time. They've ironed out some of the tweaks in the source code. They've got a new circuit design. They just want to make and sell product. And they come back to us and they say, well, you didn't deliver. You didn't deliver according to the purchase order, so we've got a contractual issue here. We were faced with contractual risk. And we said, well, that's nice for you, but in order for you to go away and sell your product, you need a license under our background IP. So you can't just sue us, even if you could prove this breach of contract that you're alleging. You couldn't possibly just sue us because that'll lock you out of this product. We'll never give you a license for any of this stuff. And they said, oh, right, okay, fair enough. But I see you've got that new project that you're working on. This new IP, I've heard that you're in bed with a tier 1 manufacturer. This is a massive deal for you. This is big value. What are you going to do? And so pragmatically, in practical terms, it was in everyone's interests to come to a deal, right? It's just a question of terms. It's just a question of what are the terms of the divorce? What are the terms of the separation? How favorable a deal can you get? Now, the reason it's an issue, and I need to go into this a little bit. Stop me if I'm boring you, but if you think about the IP space here, there's a boundary at the edge of the stuff that's owned by our company, and it might be in a particular piece of documentation. It might be in a particular piece of confidential information, and in order for us to apply leverage associated with this IP, it's most likely that it's going to occur here. The stuff that's going to be relevant to Company B's new IP is going to be right out here. But in order for us to take action there, we're faced with a risk because we don't know necessarily that the IP that we're going to try to enforce is necessarily 100% ours. If we're taking action under copyright, can we definitely prove authorship? Can we definitely prove ownership? Or is it perhaps mixed up in some way with something that Company B might already own, right? So even before we can begin to apply pressure, we need to make a risk calculation. We've got uncertainty to deal with. Likewise, sitting on the other side of the table, we can see a region here in our new product that we want to sell to this tier 1 automotive manufacturer, where we need access to their IP. And actually this boundary down here, this is unclear for us. And so we're looking at, actually, can we be sure that we don't infringe? Can we be sure this isn't copied? Actually, I don't know. I don't want to go back through 2 years worth of project documentation. Can you imagine how much a Magic Circle law firm would charge you to have a trainee go through the project documentation and just give you a view about the risk? It's insane. You know, they'd set the clock running and they'd stop when your bank balance ran out. Actually, what's needed here, what's needed to resolve this situation is objective leverage. You need objective leverage. You need something that is set in stone, where ownership is clear, and you know that it covers the product. You know that it covers the technology. Even if it's not the technology at issue, if it's technology that that company is engaged in making and selling elsewhere, it gives you leverage, right? Because at the moment, this is just uncertainty. You don't have any levers that you can definitely pull. The answer to this mess, actually, is right back at the start, when these guys got together and we were looking at our background IP, when we were thinking about the layout of the semiconductor circuit, when we were working out how to cram those components into a small amount of semiconductor real estate, we should have been thinking about patents, right? When we were thinking about the manufacturing process to put together this pressing and the number of layers on the PCB or whatever else, we should have been thinking about patents. Because then when we come to sit down, we've got levers we know we can definitely press. And the other side are looking at their risk calculation and they're saying, well, actually, I can't necessarily know that I can go off and make and sell this product and stock a huge warehouse with it, because if it infringes their background IP, as well it might, if there's a patent in the background that controls it, I need to take account of that. It's a risk for me, because they might turn up and ask for all the stock out of my warehouse. They might ask for the destruction of my machine tooling. So it's about having leverage to control the terms of that separation, to make sure that you're able to walk away from the table with what you want. Are there any questions at that point? I've probably been talking quite a lot. I need a break for... No questions at all. Stunned silence. Everyone's still awake, though. Yeah. Now, there's one more IP situation that I see time and time again, actually, and it's in an imbalance between potential commercial partners. I'll tell you, I'll use an example again. A client of mine makes and sells springs for mousetraps. Okay, they make and sell springs for mousetraps, and recently they developed a new spring. It's quite a clever spring, and they came across the opportunity to sell that spring to one of the biggest installers of mousetraps anywhere in the world. And their sales guys were presented with the contract, and he said, "This is amazing. I'm going to make my bonus for the next 10 years. Show me the dotted line. Where do I sign?" So the sales director signs the contract. There were IP clauses in that contract which said any IP associated with the product or the development of the product is going to be owned by the customer. And I think in the shoes of that sales director, I might have thought about signing the contract too. Because do you really want to raise a quibble about the IP? Do you really want to say, actually, hang on guys, this isn't fair, we need to hang on to a bit of the IP so when we move into projects in future, we've got something to protect us, the value in our business is in our IP, you can't take it all from us. I'm not sure I would have been able to have that conversation. But what I've found in practice is that legal leads and people who are more senior in companies like that tend to be fairly pragmatic. They tend to be prepared to make a decision that doesn't completely screw everybody over. And actually, a little bit of leverage in those circumstances can go a long way. If at the point you'd been having that conversation, that sales director could have said, this is a great opportunity, I'm really excited about it, we can't wait to work with you, and actually we've got some patents here which I think are relevant to this project and can help protect us in the marketplace as we work together. As part of our deal, we'll give you a license under this background IP because we know it to be relevant to this project. Let's cooperate and work together under the shelter of these patents. I'll give you a license to that background IP. And as we work together, naturally, of course, the IP that we develop, we'll give you a license to that as well, but we'll retain ownership. And it changes the tone of the conversation because now you're, from a small amount of leverage, you're in a position now where you can get a little bit more because you're engaged in a project with a customer who's paying you to develop new technology and you're walking away with the IP. So the next time you're making a risk calculation, you're looking at your matrix of threats and opportunities, you've got that IP in your back pocket from that deal you had. And so the next time you're in an unbalanced situation where someone's demanding an indemnity from you or some other unreasonable consideration, you've got just that little bit more leverage, and over time you're no longer the little guy, you're no longer the guy who's just going to get squashed. You just grow gradually, bit by bit, patent by patent, you increase the leverage you have in the marketplace, and really, as I see it, that's the game and how it's played. So what do you do about all of this stuff? Actually, you do the simple stuff. You do the simple stuff. Have an IP policy, make sure that people know what it is. Give people some training. You've got a big organization, you've got lots of people. Are your sales force aware of IP? Are they out there being your eyes and ears? What are your advisors doing to train your guys? Make sure you keep records if you're engaged in a commercial cooperation. Bare minimum, guys, keep records. Make sure you know what's happened and when. And don't just work under an NDA. Make sure you've got a proper IP agreement in place. But more than all of that, identify opportunities when they arise. Remember that irritation patent. Remember the risk calculation about, do I file this case or not? Do I go ahead with that project or not? Identify those opportunities that arise where you can register strategic IP that will control a marketplace for you. It's not necessarily always the clever stuff, it's the small stuff. And actually, the game you're engaged in playing is loading future risk calculations in your own favor. You're there to make other people have their decision-making be driven by your IP. And actually, my own view is that patents probably are the simplest, cheapest, most effective way to do it, I think. So, I've probably said enough, and I should stop. I'd be very interested to hear any questions you might have. Sorry, the question was whether the exchange of information and the control of exchange of information, whether people should pay more attention to it, and whether I think they'll pay more attention to it in future. Is that right? Is that?
I work for a firm, and through the company suggestion scheme, we started developing a thing that was basically, it's years ago now, but oil slicks were a big thing.
Right.
And an employee had suggested a method of containing the oil and collecting the oil. And while we were working on it, the design draftsman who was working on the project showed it to some visitors in passing. 2 months later, it's on tomorrow's world as somebody else's property. Sad for all people concerned. it was the 70s and we were naive then. But I don't think we're much better now.
No, I think you're exactly right. I think there's a frighteningly low level of attention paid to these issues. I've seen patents from two companies in the West Midlands that controlled roadside recovery vehicles, and they were each filed within a week of each other by companies that were half a mile down the road, and the drawings in those patents were almost identical. And I don't know for certain, but I've got a fairly strong suspicion that the drawings came from an invitation to tender document, and that information was just released. They just gave it out. Here, guys, have a look at this. Do you think you can do this? And they said, yeah, thanks very much. And they went and filed the applications. So people are playing the game, and people need to protect themselves. It's about awareness raising. Something we like to do is to give training to people we work with, because there's some people, you talk about patents, you talk about IP, that's nothing to do with me. What are you talking about? And I'm talking to a software developer, I'm talking to a software engineer, or the guy who's writing control algorithms for a metrology instrument, and he thinks that IP is nothing to do with him. And so, yes, I agree with you. Awareness is the issue, and making people aware of what the policy is and what they're supposed to do. Yeah, definitely agree.
We're working with our customer to look at a new process,
Right.
And working with a university.
Right.
So who then claims the IP for that?
Naturally, you've got a detailed agreement.
We're paying for it.
And what does the agreement say?
We haven't got an agreement yet. This is something just...
Okay. That's probably something not to talk about through an amplifier, but I'll have a chat with you in a minute if that's all right. It's something you need to pay. I think the starting position would be that knowing universities and how they operate, the university would be very likely to have ownership of IP originating from the inventions that come out of the university. They have a look at what the agreement says, and then the commercial operators, I don't know.